Hoy estamos en este panel número 2. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a los participantes, a los ponentes. El panel tiene por nombre Condiciones laborales en contexto de virtualidad y retorno presencial. Mi nombre es Fidel García, pues de nuevo presidente del Colegio de Profesores de Educación Media de Honduras. Queremos decirle a los presentes que va a haber una constancia de participación. Si la quieren pues obtener, tendrán que tener un mínimo de 80% de asistencia a este foro. Y habrá una lista de registro en el chat. Y si no sé, en caso de que alguien no se pueda descargar la lista, puede escribir en el chat sus datos y el lugar de donde está conectado, y los compañeros con mucho gusto van a registrar su asistencia. Eso para los que quieren tener pues un diploma de asistencia o un certificado de asistencia. Les recordamos que hay interpretación simultánea, traducción en los idiomas de nuestro continente, lo cual pueden activar indicando en el icono de idiomas y seleccionar si desean inglés o desean el idioma de Miguel de Cervantes, el español. Si tienen alguna dificultad, puede escribirnos en el chat y el equipo técnico les ayudará a resolver con mucho gusto. El panel está programado para 1 hora y la dinámica que vamos a tener es justamente cada ponente. Tenemos 3 ponentes. Tenemos al compañero Eduardo Pereyra de la Argentina, el compañero Jackson Potter de Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, y tenemos a el compañero Gary Fenn de Canadá. Serán nuestros ponentes y cada uno tendrá un tiempo máximo de 10 minutos para hacer su presentación. Habrá una ronda de preguntas y comentarios por parte de los asistentes y podrán dejar pues sus preguntas en el chat, o los que van a estar interactuando con nosotros a través del Facebook también pueden dejar sus preguntas ahí. Y después los asistentes van a responder en un máximo de 2 minutos. Las preguntas pueden ser puntuales. Si la pregunta es directa para uno de los ponentes o es una pregunta en general, pues ahí lo van a poder indicar. Ellos van a responder en un máximo de 2 minutos. También el moderador, en este caso su servidor, leerá las preguntas realizadas en los chats de Zoom. Para esto vamos a destinar 10 minutos. Luego viene una ronda de respuestas y conclusiones, 5 o 7 minutos por ponentes. Luego iremos al cierre del panel para dar paso a la plenaria. Los ponentes, como ya lo dijimos, el compañero Eduardo Pereyra de Argentina. Él es secretario de Relaciones Internacionales de la Confederación de Trabajadores de la Educación de la República Argentina. Es autor en el libro El legado de Paulo Freire en la educación pública y en el trabajo docente, publicado recientemente por COPEMH. Jackson Potter de Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, integrante del Sindicato de Maestros de Chicago, CTU, por sus siglas en inglés, o Chicago Teachers Union. Y Gary Fenn de Canadá, asistente ejecutivo en la Federación de Maestros de Escuelas Secundarias de Ontario, con sede en Toronto, Canadá. Anteriormente fue negociador jefe y oficial de distrito en OSSTF. Así que tenemos pues listo todo. Hay un exquisito tema, las condiciones laborales en contexto de la virtualidad y retorno presencial, y por supuesto que tenemos a 3 grandes ponentes y solamente pues nos resta disfrutar de ello. Vamos a pedir entonces al compañero Eduardo Pereyra, que en el orden será nuestro primer ponente. Adelante, compañero Eduardo Pereyra, desde la hermana República de Argentina.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes para nosotros aquí desde Argentina. Fidel, gracias por la presentación. Es un gusto estar aquí con los que van a compartir este panel, con Gary, con Jackson, pero también felicitar su excelente exposición de recién a Roberto. Compartimos 100% a su exposición. Y compartimos también la lucha del pueblo brasileño para que no esté más Bolsonaro de presidente. Gritamos todos los días fuera Bolsonaro y esperamos que el próximo presidente sea Lula da Silva. Lo deseamos, lo ansiamos y lo soñamos también. Bueno, y Steve, por supuesto, que está aquí y estuvo siempre dirigiendo esta red, que como decían también en el anterior panel, es parte de esas luchas por la defensa de la escuela pública que no se agota en el docente ni en el estudiante, ¿no? Es la amplia coalición de fuerzas, porque del otro lado hay una amplia coalición de fuerzas que quieren que la escuela pública cumpla otro rol distinto del que nosotros pensamos. Le voy a pedir entonces a Fidel que no tenga ningún problema en indicarme cuándo se cumple mi tiempo, porque me voy a enganchar con los temas y seguramente me voy a pasar del tiempo. Bien, para comenzar, la temática fue muy importante para nosotros, sigue siéndolo. Aquí en Argentina ya estamos con la presencialidad total en todo el país. Tenemos al 100% de los docentes que tuvieron la voluntad de vacunarse vacunados, y esa fue también vacunados con las 2 dosis. Esa fue también una lucha del sindicato docente que el gobierno tomó como prioridad. Los docentes tuvieron prioridad para vacunarse. Y digamos que cuando nosotros discutimos el tema laboral, lo incluimos dentro del tema de enseñanza-aprendizaje. No es solamente que la categoría...
About a working category, and that it is just including labor relationships of the teachers and professors. But that category related to a workload, to a workplace, is directly related to the possibility of learning from our students. There may not be teaching without learning. Furthermore, for us, the best way of facing the struggle against sectors who are not teachers or students in this broad coalition is tough. We see this as one thing only, teachers together with students. That's the best way. We are looking for the best way to learn and teach, both together, teachers and students. Overnight, 1.5 billion students and 64 million professors had to leave our daily place, which was the public school, and go to virtual education, something that has never been seen before in the history of education here. This has never happened before. It's unprecedented, and therefore it required unprecedented responses too. What we saw at the beginning from the unionized front was that there was full support from society, including the dominant economic sectors. So it was necessary to move to virtual education. I share this with you because that lasted only 2 months, especially in concentrated sectors of economy. And during the 3rd month, they started to demand the government for children to go back to the schoolrooms. They talked about the mask, all the sanitation measures, but they had to go back, especially when the highest peak of pandemic was present there. So what did we see between and amongst our periods? Well, many different things, but I want to focus on 2 aspects mainly. On the one hand, they were anxious to prove that thousands and thousands of our students did not have access to technological tools for teachers to teach them on a virtual basis. So we're talking about students that had no computers, many families who did not have a cell phone, or maybe in the family they just had one cell phone that the father or the mother required to work, or any of the other siblings who also studied. That was the best case scenario. But then there was a problem because virtual education was not for all, just for a few. The most favored sectors of society had other devices, including computers, laptops, cell phones, as it happens in every single society of Latin America, at least. So here we see the first problem. And the second problem is the labor burden. So work schedules were diluted, faded. There was not the time in which we moved from school and then we left and went home. No, throughout the day, parents were asking questions, mothers, fathers, WhatsApp exchange between students and professors all day long. So the working schedule was expanded to the whole day. This generated stress. First of all, not all children could have access to electronic devices to receive virtual education. And then the working burden, which lasted all day long. So as the union organization, we talked to the government and we said we need to talk about a discussion between teachers. This is like a social dialogue. We needed to come to an agreement between the government and the unions, teaching unions, to establish a new labor regime. And we came to an agreement. During the third month, we had this agreement. In Argentina, agreements between the government and the unions are based on the law, so they are mandatory. We need to abide by them. Now, very briefly, what did that agreement include? First off, to acknowledge the teaching work during the pandemic, the virtual work. We've never had this before. It was non-existent before. The only sector in Argentina in which there was virtual education, partial virtual education in some cases, was in the higher education in universities, but the rest of the education system was always face-to-face education. Now, second, we guaranteed all the payments. We worked with the same payment as before, and there was a possibility of having licenses. We acknowledged any disease of professors or teachers, and then that professor or teacher was replaced by another professor. Then respect the working time, what we call the right to disconnection. The professor could disconnect as soon as they finished their work, the working schedule. This was of extreme importance. This was very welcome by our professors and teachers, and it was a great achievement because they could come out from this very initial stressful situation, acknowledging the work accident insurance coverage. We acknowledged accidents at home as part of working accidents as if they were at school. And then we also accepted union rights. The company accepted all of these. They could execute their own leave of absence to go to union meetings. And we held training actions. That is, if there were teachers meetings that day, classes were not given, and they worked together. And there were other agreements, but it would be too long if I explained to you everything. That was the first agreement. And so labor stress decreased. Secondly, we agreed printing 6,000 teaching booklets made by the education workers to share with students that had no connection. Therefore, we ensured almost 100% of our students in the country receiving education. In some cases, virtual education, and in other cases, by means of these booklets that we distributed. The third element is that we used 30,000 new positions amongst the students. So they were visited. If they had no devices, the professors visited and taught them there. The fourth element is we built an observatory on policies related to the pandemic. What for? To be able to discuss with every government, the national and the province governments, based on the number of cases. We're talking about COVID cases in each place, in the district, in the city, in the town. If we started releasing permits to go to school and have face-to-face education. We discussed this together with union. Up to that moment, many governments wanted to solve this, to decide when we would have face-to-face education. So under the observatory, we came to this agreement. We assigned different researchers to define this, and then another problem came up, the one I mentioned a while ago. Entrepreneurial sectors were pressing. They wanted to go back to school, to face-to-face education, because they needed parents to be working in their company. So here we see something which is called as a window of opportunity to discuss what we were discussing in the first panel, in which Andre and Roberto mentioned so wisely. On the one hand, the trading sectors that talk about the great virtues of virtual education above face-to-face education. And then Bill Gates was giving advice to the state of New York, so there was no face-to-face education. So our partner from the United States should tell us if that's an extraordinary expenditure from the state when you can receive virtual education. On the one hand, that was a great debate to decide if they were going back to school or not. And they defended virtual education. On the other hand, entrepreneurs saying, go back to school, go back to face-to-face education, because we need parents in our factories to ensure the capitalistic system. So there's a great window of opportunity there, and we are working very hard on this. Eduardo, you have to close now. All right, so let me close. Great debate is now open. It started during the pandemic, and although the pandemic is not over, face-to-face education is back, and the productive sector is there. And we have to decide what school we want, what type of education we want. This is the best time. We want to go back to school to pre-pandemic. Is that the school that we dreamt of for our countries? Do we have to decide that? In Argentina, we believe that we have to make the best out of this opportunity, because the pandemic modified our reality, and it was modified for not really for good. Rich people are richer, wealthy people are wealthier, and poor people are poorer. But now we can discuss a new type of education, an education that will at least help discuss these situations on inequality. And I'm going to stop, and then I shall entertain some questions. Thank you very much, Eduardo. We understand that 10 minutes is not much for this subject matter. But we see now how we identify with each other. In Latin America, we have many similar aspects. In Argentina, you have a few aspects that we don't have in the rest of the country, such as vaccination. In Honduras, the professors were never priority. The right to disconnection, we still don't have it. And you have great progress in acknowledging labor accidents at home and the booklets to teach. Maybe that's not what's happening in the rest of the countries, but we see how labor conditions may vary from one country to the other, but there will always be something that's a common denominator, which is threats in labor conditions. Thank you very much, Eduardo. From Argentina. You may start writing your questions through the chat. If you are in Facebook, you can write your questions there as well. Now, let us listen to Mr. Jackson Potter, our partner from the United States of America. So, Jackson, if you are ready, the floor is yours. Go ahead, Jackson.
Thank you, Fidel. Gracias, Fidel. I'm going to talk about the United States context in general for teachers in public schools, and Chicago more specifically. When COVID broke out, it was about March 20th, 2020, when schools closed down in Chicago and went fully remote. And the mayor was reluctant initially and adopted President Trump's position that teachers were essential workers. Even though we knew very little about the disease, the position both at the national level and the local level of political leaders was that the economy was more important than human life. But we resisted. We were able to get the schools to close initially. We stayed remote for the next period through the fall. But starting in January of 2021, the schools and the mayor started to bring students and teachers back in a hybrid model that was partially in person, partially remote, except for preschool teachers were kind of forced back in person. And then it went to kindergarten through eighth grade and finally high school. This method and strategy of management, it reduced our solidarity. Sorry, I'm at the school right now, so we have an announcement. This diminished our solidarity because they were able to break apart people in different groups. But it also led to some amazing resistance. And so once the pre-kindergarten teachers were brought back, a number of us refused to go back in person, refused to report unless it was on the computer remotely, because there weren't proper mitigation methods or guarantees in place. So there was a lot of concern that more students would get sick. Many of my students were in a low-income, primarily Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. Many of their family members were sick. Many died. So this was a real issue, that this was going to spread COVID in the schools. So when our pre-kindergarten members refused to go back, they were threatened with discipline, threatened with being fired, and we came together to support them and each other, demanding less online class time, more staff, vaccine access for both teachers and students, testing for COVID, a metric to determine when we would need to close schools if there was an outbreak, contact tracing, masks, and hand sanitizer, like other guests have talked about, and elimination of any discipline that teachers received for refusing to work in unsafe conditions. And eventually we won many of those things in an agreement, a return to work agreement. There have been challenges, lack of computers, many undocumented families, Mexican families, Latin American families, immigrant families, did not receive any financial assistance from the government during this period, even though many people were laid off from their jobs. We had homeless students that did not receive extra additional services or support during this period. And many students faced mental health issues. So we conducted, in the spirit of Freire, we conducted outreach to parents and community stakeholders in order for us to define collectively what a remote, hybrid, and in-person conditions would be acceptable. And our vision for public schools during this period and after COVID, not going back to normal, that was unacceptable. We also did a lot of mutual aid, making sure families were fed, had cash assistance. Teachers raised a lot of money and support for families that weren't receiving it. And really at the heart of the debate in the United States was an argument about survival. Do people get basic rights during a pandemic, or do we have to go to work and risk our lives? Those were the questions. And the pandemic forced us, our members and the society more largely, to really embrace anti-capitalist and anti-racist values. The Black Lives Matter movement in protest against George Floyd's murder occurred during this period, and it was the largest protest movement in US history. We learned the importance of mental health, broad coalitions, educations that we control, not the tech industry, is what actually people prefer. And ironically, it's what capitalism prefers. The capitalists realize that they need us in classrooms, in person, and that we have leverage to shape and use our power to determine what that looks like, more so than ever, I think, because of this realization. In Los Angeles, for example, they were able to win a new model of schools called Sustainable Community Schools, 50 schools that are created with parents, with students, with community groups, and have different pedagogy that really emphasizes liberation over adhering to the rules or getting a job. for the state or for the system. So here are some opportunities and threats, and I will finish my comments. I think we have reduced the reliance on standardized tests because of this new thinking. More university systems are rejecting standardized tests. A threat is that there are more racial and economic disparities in the United States and in the world, and that will be exacerbated when assistance from the government begins to decline. In Illinois, for example, in Chicago, 60,000 people are in danger of being evicted from their homes because they can't pay rent. 200,000 people are in danger of losing their homes because they cannot pay their mortgage. An opportunity, we are more aware of the importance of socialization in pedagogy and direct experience. A threat, Andre talked about this. There's more surveillance technology governing our teaching and learning. I think another threat is we lack international coordination and solidarity, not because of Red Cepa. I blame more of the rich countries, the United States, the Chicago Teachers Union. We could do more. Rich countries need to do more. The forces for public education to demand equity in resources, equity in vaccines, like what Fidel was saying about Honduras. We should not be getting boosters when teachers in Honduras cannot get their initial vaccine. An opportunity, we have increased awareness of economic and racial disparities and inequality, and new possibilities to grow local and national political transformation. And then last, the United States is a threat to the world. It still is. The far right continues to have a lot of power. And I do not think it's unlikely, unfortunately, that a Trump or someone like him would win re-election in the next cycle. And that threatens the ability of the planet to survive, not just political possibilities in the United States. So thank you for this opportunity and hope to talk more.
Bueno, gracias Jackson por la puntualidad y ser el buen manejo.
Thank you, Jackson, for being so punctual and for managing time so well. We are monitoring now questions. We will listen to Gary Fenn from Canada. Gary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I just want to check everyone can hear me okay. I see some nods. Yes. Perfecto. Thanks, and thank you very much. And it's good to see some familiar faces again, albeit virtually, and I hope that we have the opportunity to get together in person sometime soon. I'm going to talk to you today from the perspective of Canada, but focus more on the province of Ontario. Education is the jurisdiction of the provinces in Canada, so mine will be a bit more of an Ontario case, but in listening to my colleagues across Canada, we share, of course, many of the same struggles and issues around virtual learning and returning to school in a safe way, and the conditions we faced over the last 18 months. Just by a summary quickly, in Ontario and across Canada for that matter, schools closed mid-March in 2020 and stayed closed till the end of the school year, and everyone switched to virtual. I think Eduardo put it in perspective when he said how many people, both educators and students, all at once went from in buildings to virtual learning, and that had never been done before. And our teachers, our education workers, and our students and families had to do that with little to no preparation, and as a result, with little to no support from the provincial government and from local school boards. Granted, they were caught a little off guard, but it took months before there was action and funding put into place to support those students and their educators to make for some kind of positive learning experience. But our members in our union, our teachers, our education workers, of course, do their best under difficult circumstances. And so we stayed virtual until the end of that school year. Schools reopened in September 2020 with new conditions put in place for safety. But of course, the government had done very little to prepare. We called for a number of things. We called for better ventilation. Nothing happened. The government said that they would bring in filters for all the classrooms. That never happened. They did require masking for all students and for staff. That did happen. But they also said, we'll do rapid testing of students and staff. But that didn't happen. So what happened, of course, were that in Ontario, many schools closed right after the Christmas holidays. And some started to reopen depending on what region of the province they were in through into February. And then the numbers spiked again, the third wave. And all schools in Ontario closed in April and stayed closed until June. And we all switched to virtual again, many of us for the third time in a year and a half. Now, across Canada, other provinces kept their schools open with some small exceptions. I know in British Columbia, one school district outside of Vancouver did close for a little while and go fully virtual. But we were the difference in the country. Ontario had schools closed and students in virtual learning the most across the province because our cases were the worst. And that's because of poor government action and poor government funding to try to stem the growth of the virus across the province. But schools are open now, and we're staying open. And we've had the challenge of, are the conditions safe? In Ontario, there is a law where you can issue a work refusal. You can make a work refusal if you find your working conditions are unsafe. And it requires a Ministry of Labor inspector to come in and check things out. However, we had very few Ministry of Labor orders written, very few violations cited. We have launched some grievances, but very few have been successful, and still a bunch of those grievances are still in process. It takes a long time to get a grievance through the system. But at the start of the school year, we had 5 very simple calls. Vaccinations was the first. We do support mandatory vaccination of staff and subsequently of students. Right now in Ontario, children between the ages of 12 and 17 can be vaccinated. We have just heard that a drug from Pfizer has been approved, is about to be approved for 5 to 11-year-olds. And we support that, as do all of the education unions in Ontario. Most of our members are vaccinated, although, much like the rest of society, there's a few that are not. Teachers were supposed to be a priority. And we've heard in some countries where teachers were a priority. Our government announced that teachers would be a higher priority than other groups. But when it was announced that teachers could go get vaccinations, there were no vaccinations available. It took about 5 to 6 more months before teachers would have access to vaccinations, which really, it ended up being by the beginning of the school year before we could see a more saturation of teachers get vaccinated. However, most are. Ventilation we called for. I mentioned that earlier. Most schools do have high quality ventilation units in classrooms, but not all. The government promised this a full year ago and said they were coming. And it took them over a year to get them, and they're still not completely deployed. We call for masking. That has happened. Students are required to wear masks in the school, as are educators. Testing. A lot of talk, no action. And the government announced a few pilot programs for rapid testing in schools, which many experts say is a good way to stop the spread of COVID. But very few random tests rapid tests are available out in our schools. They only seem to show up where we see outbreaks. The last thing we've called for is distancing. the ability for students to physically distance from each other. That means smaller class sizes. In no way are there smaller class sizes. In fact, we've seen some bigger class sizes where we see 30, 35 students crammed into elementary schools and in high schools together in small spaces. And the government and health units, local health units, have called for what we call cohorting. I don't know if you can translate that, Steve. Cohorting, which means you keep students in groups together so they don't mix with other groups of students. Well, that doesn't really exist because students are allowed to interact with anyone before school, on their buses, at lunch, after school. So there is no cohorting, even though they say there is. So have we got all these things? Well, as you heard, no, not really. But also, what we have seen, and Jackson alluded to this, about solidarity and trust. Teachers and education workers have become more popular, if I could say that, and more trusted than they were before. And strangely enough, teachers' unions have garnered a higher level of trust due to the campaigning we have done calling for these greater safety measures. In fact, trust levels are far higher than they are of the government. And this is interesting because we had just completed a round of bargaining, a very difficult round of bargaining that involved rotating strikes just before COVID started. And we settled just as the pandemic started up. And we were able to get public support when the government was trying to negotiate significant cuts to education and sharp increases to class sizes. Now, seeing my time is nearly done, I'm going to mention one particular thing about virtual learning that's been a problem in some of our school boards. The Ontario government has left it completely up to local school boards, and there are over 70 local school boards in the province of Ontario. Those school boards have been left to decide how they'll deal with remote learning, because the government said you must offer a remote learning choice for students this coming school year. Some have set up virtual schools. What we're saying are temporary virtual schools for those students and parents who are concerned about getting COVID at schools. But some have also decided not to set up a virtual school and instead do what we call hybrid learning. And that term may be familiar to some of you. Hybrid learning in our context means you have one class, but some are learning in an actual physical classroom with the teacher, but that same teacher is also teaching students watching online, live streamed into that same classroom. We call it distracted learning because the teacher has to go back and forth between the computer screen and the students in person and try to deliver the lesson to both simultaneously. It's burning a number of our teachers out. Many of our boards don't do this, but it seems that the urban boards, like Toronto.
That's it, Gary.
Couple minutes.
Gracias, Gary.
Thank you, Gary.
Oh, he's frozen.
We found it very interesting that Canada's facing problems that are very similar to Honduras in the area of education. But we want to allow time for a round of questions and comments. And he has frozen. And so we're opening to a space for questions or commentaries towards the presenters. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, your virtual hand. Hello.
Buenas tardes, ¿puedo hablar?
May I speak? Go ahead, compañera Cisa Pacari. Yes, thank you. colleagues. Thank you, Steve, and all the organizers, the Idea Network organizers and the teachers who are organizing and participating in this forum. I just want to reflect a little on the question of the reality of teachers in the role of unions. In the unions in other countries, like we've heard in Chile and Argentina, there's a strengthening of the teachers' unions, not just in the rural areas, but in the rural areas. I'm talking about where there's large indigenous populations. They're really pushing distance education and platform education. And to me, it seems like the platforms seem like a danger to isolate teachers and to give them heavy days and administrative tasks that doesn't give them time to meet with the other teachers and to support the work of the unions. For example, here in the rural areas in Ecuador, the intercultural bilingual educators, I feel like they've been left behind by the unions because they don't have the space to meet with their colleagues and learn about the work that the union's doing. So I think given the fact that we interact, the teachers tend to interact through groups of WhatsApp, but that's not enough to carry out an effective struggle in defense of education. And so we haven't been able to carry forward the law for intercultural education and the reforms are supposed to reduce the amount of the workday to 6 hours of attending to students, but this has not been carried out in the countryside. And so my question is, how, as unions, are we working to integrate rural and indigenous intercultural educators who often are left out in the movement to kind of virtual education? Cisa, is that for any of the panelists? Yes, any of the panelists that wish to, because they have different experiences in their countries. So how do we strengthen the teachers union? From the maybe Eduardo could open with a response for that.
Bueno, es una muy buena y difícil. Perdón, Eduardo, y creo que
excuse me, Eduardo. I think you are ahead of a lot of Latin America in terms of the advances that CTERA has made. So maybe when you're talking about this, you could also talk about how you made this. So how do we strengthen the unions and the support among rural teachers for the unions? It's a very complicated question to answer because it's got different angles. And I want to first say to not brag about all the victories or advances that we've gotten, is that we were lucky to have in power at the time of the pandemic a government that is one that's willing to listen, a government that is open to the social movements and will respond to them, which is very different than we had a couple of years before. And if we hadn't elected a progressive government prior to the pandemic, we would have been facing the same situation that they're facing under Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so it's a struggle, as Paulo Freire said, and in his honor is that the political struggle is part of the defense of education. I need to say that we in the 11th of September, the same year that we carried out an action against the coup in Chile. That the line at the time was that the unions should be pure and not be involved in politics, but we've been very clear about the need to have political action and to be involved in the pedagogy, and to not just deal with labor demands, because that cuts us off from the population, and it opens up space for the right to occupy that space. If we only argued about salaries for ourselves, and we would have every right to do that, because that's the legitimate role of unions. But when we go in front of the unemployed workers or workers with low salaries, we need to be able to discuss also the issues of pedagogy, which is related to conditions of work and the health of workers. These are all pedagogical issues, and that affect the learning teaching process. And so working in these areas of pedagogy helps us to engage a broader sector of society in supporting our movement for public education. And but of course, when we're facing governments of the right, it's even, you could have the best program and it's still hard to get action. And so that's why we need to involve also in politics to ensure that we have governments in power that are open and willing to listen to us. And so in this, we connect our protests or fights for rights with the broader society for structural changes. And so that we always take this into account whenever we're fighting, what we are fighting for, and we tightly relation that with conditions in the classroom, learning conditions for students, and its benefit not just for teachers, but for students and for society in general. Thank you, Eduardo. Jackson, do you have any observations you'd like to share on that? The question that was made about how, in the first panel, about how to link the different organizations in Latin America, and the question of Cisa Picare around strengthening the teachers' unions. And then Eduardo was touching on the importance of the political projection of teachers' union. Jackson, do you have any observations on those?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the political context has a huge difference and impact on what we can do, what we struggle for, what we struggle against. So agree very much with Eduardo about those conditions being very critical to determining our strategy. I think Cisa asks a very good question. And one way we addressed it, and it's probably different, I imagine, in Ecuador and other countries with less infrastructure. But, you know, because our members had computers and internet, we were able to hold meetings across the entire membership using Zoom. And we had the best attendance of any meetings we've had in our history, in part because people were home. And so it became a daily strategy session rather than a monthly one that we would normally have in person, because of these conditions that actually increased, I think, the connection, participation in some ways. But it's still a poor substitute. I think Cisa is getting to that in her question. And I think that's why we need to demand vaccine access. You know, we should in Chicago be demanding that we send our vaccines to you in Honduras and to those of you in Ecuador so that you can begin meeting in person again, because it is a poor substitute. We will suffer eventually by meeting remotely. We can't capture the same details. We don't listen as carefully. We don't understand the comments or context as well. We don't pay attention. So it's very difficult. And I do think, you know, we have to figure out ways around it, even if it means meeting outside with masks on. That can be better than continuing to do this as people get exhausted and stop connecting through these different means.
Compañero Gary.
Thanks.
Gary?
Yep. Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous members and Indigenous communities in Ontario. Just a very quick history. 3.5 years ago, Ontario elected a conservative government. And the first thing they did was to end a revision of our curriculum across kindergarten to grade 12 that would infuse Indigenous content and Indigenous learnings into the curriculum. And I sat at a Ministry of Education table prior to this election, where we as a union were supportive of these changes. The province was consulting Indigenous elders, knowledge keepers, on what to do, and we were on a good path, and the new government came in and just stopped it. Now, slowly it's starting to come back as the government heard loud and clear how that was a bad move, especially with Canada going through a truth and reconciliation process. And some of you may have heard in the last year the discovery of bodies of Indigenous children underneath what used to be residential schools that were run by the church and the state. A very sad and terrible, absolutely terrible chapter in our history that has been, that Indigenous peoples knew about and told us about, but we refuse to sort of acknowledge until now. So there's been a lot of change in that regard. And what that has done too is galvanized a lot of our members who are from Indigenous communities, and our federation has been engaged with the government consistently, supporting all of the recommendations that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I wanted to acknowledge that. In the rural areas, we've seen how it's galvanized support across the union in our rural areas because the issue of online learning and poor internet access. What's actually, the government continued to claim, oh, we built the infrastructure, it's going to be better, and it hasn't. And strangely enough, even in our urban centers, internet access has been problematic. You can imagine in a city like Toronto, where you have a building with 1,000 units in it, so many of which that have families, and all going online through the same line during the day, and a lot of internet issues. But for our rural members, we've seen more engagement throughout this pandemic. The last thing I'll say, though, we've come out with an education platform, our federation, because we have an election in Ontario coming up in June, and our goal is to get rid of this conservative government that has only sought to destroy public education and privatize it as much as they can, even though they claim that they are full supporters of public education. Our platform, we took some lessons, I'll say, from my comrade in Chicago, Jackson, and what CTU has done, what Los Angeles teachers have done. We got away from a platform that would just focus on us as educators, as the union. What do we need? Instead, we have focused a platform that says what's good for public education, but also for our communities. We're calling for things like a universal basic income, better childcare, permanent sick days. That's been a major issue in our province and in the country, where unless you belong to a union, you have no access to sick days. And so we've called for those kinds of things. So we're starting. That's been our call for in this platform, and we hope that it's not, again, it's looking at building not just better public education system, but better communities with public education at the heart of it. And our members, they told us that's what they wanted. We consulted communities, that's what they wanted to see from us. So that's been a good unifying source for our membership recently, and we're hoping that we're able to get rid of this government.
Gracias, Gary.
Thank you, Gary. If there are any other participations, the participants, raise your hand. Thank you for the responses from the speakers. Excellent illustrations of different experiences. We have seen how the political context has a big difference on what we can achieve in the labor process. We hope that in Honduras we can improve. We say that we're getting close to the end of the dictatorship. 28th of November, we have elections where we're hoping to remove a hard right government that's been in power since the 2009 coup. But we fear that the dictatorship will not give up power so quickly. If there are no more questions, we'll revise the chat. Can I say something? There was one part from CISA's question that I did not respond to. Education International, Latin America section, of which CETERA belongs to, has a intercultural network that is preparing its fourth encounter of Indigenous educators. There's been a lot written of concrete proposals to develop not just at the school level, but also in demands for specifically for bilingual intercultural education, because often they're left isolated, or it's a very marginalized portion of the public education system. So in the Education International Latin America, we have been active in promoting this network. But as CISA said, it's really an area that under these conditions, current conditions of the pandemic, has really been left isolated. And I also want to support what the compañera from a week after the coup in Honduras, we visited Honduras, and it was really clear to us how teachers were on the front line of resisting the coup and have worked ever since to try and return a democratic and popular government to that country. Thank you, Eduardo. And we ask everyone to keep an eye on us in our election on the 28th of November. I'm going to ask Maria Ramos to help me to read out if there's any questions from Facebook or I do see one question from the compañera Linda Porales. She had a question that Eduardo had said that there are 30,000 new positions added to visit students in their homes. Were those new positions created of teachers, or were this just a reassignment of existing positions? The majority were new hires. There were teachers that were hired to attend to students that didn't have access to internet or Wi-Fi. Most of them were students in their final year of teaching training. And so they received the sort of basic salary that teachers start with, and they were hired for the year when we were online, doing online education. And for us, it was a very important policy because it was a way to recognize the gap in terms of access to internet, and to be able to provide that social right of education despite the sort of technology gap that exists in our society. And so it was a duty of the state to attend to those youth that didn't have access to technology or internet. And it was a state policy, but we supported it. So it was something that took place for a year until they moved back into the classrooms. It really does show the difference it has when you have a government that recognizes the importance of investing in public education and to address issues of poverty and the gaps that exist. Maria, are there any questions in Facebook? In chat, we only had that question from Linda Morales. I think Maria is not in the room, but in the chat, there's only that one question that Linda made, and we don't have any other questions. Not in Facebook. Oh, it looks like Maria is back. I'm sorry, I was in the other session. This group is finished now then? We were just seeing if there were any questions from
Recording
Facebook.
Stopped.
No, we don't have any questions in Facebook. So the sessions, they have finished in the other ones. So maybe we can answer to if you want to read the question, and then we can return to the yes, because they're returning from the other groups now. So we can now close. So we move to the closing plenary. And so Gary and Eduardo and Jackson, if you want to say anything to conclude, starting with Eduardo, we just need to reiterate that under the context of this terrible pandemic that has affected all of humanity, that Latin American teaching, I'm not sure, I can't speak for United States and Canada, but I expect so, that the International for Education in Latin America have reiterated its commitment to fight for public education and to guarantee access for all children to education. And so despite the attack of the right in many countries, teachers in our continent have really shown themselves to be up to the task of defending education, defending their students, and defending their labor rights, and bringing education to all youth. And so to continue to depend on this, bet on this commitment, and thinking of a transformative, emancipating education. If we're 2 years, we were almost closed in our classroom or in our house. We've heard of the talk about the sort of common sense. We have been able to meet and get together again. We've been able to reconnect ourselves, and there's still much work to do, much work ahead. If we want to transform Latin America, which is our dream, to reach that great country, that great common country. And so until the next time, I hope that the next time we get together, we can have a face-to-face forum like this and share the hugs that we all deserve. And Gary, I don't know if you have anything you want to say to conclude.
No, I think it's been covered really well, except to say that, what I'm hearing from other countries, there's a lot of similarities, even in Canada, where you might think things are going okay. Yeah, we may have a higher vaccination rate than some countries, but I share Jackson's comments about how we've seen vaccines go to waste here because they haven't been used, and why haven't we sent them to other countries that need them to support, especially educators who could use them so that we can get schools open and stay open and help them and help students and staff stay safe from this pandemic. So thank you for having me again, and I hope my words were provided some learning today.
Thank you. Thank you for the participation. Applause to all the participants.
Não chore, não, viu?